Hospitality, 40% is your strategic sourcing, where you work with somebody, you come up with options, you come up with a fantastic proposal that's going to drive a lot of value back to the properties. 60% is deployment, or convincing every single property.
Do you think that that is a good place for people who are interested in procurement to start their career, or do you think that's a better mid-career move?
You don't study procurement, you don't take schooling for it, especially in Canada, so you kind of fall into it.
I'm very happy, Danny, to have you on the podcast. Maybe you could start with like a quick introduction. I love for I know you, but the audience to learn a bit about who's Danny Wang and how'd you get into the world of procurement?
Yeah, no, definitely. I guess maybe it's better to kind of start from the bottom and show us where I am right now. So yeah, it's one of those things where I always say you don't, especially in Canada or the folks that I've been around with, you don't study procurement, you don't take schooling for it, and especially in Canada. So you kind of fall into it. So in
Yeah,
my earlier career of the, 10, 12 years, I was a part of a company that did a lot of contract manufacturing. This Canadian company, we grew really successfully. We started doing contract manufacturing for a lot of big OEMs around the world. That's where I started getting to, more from supplier engineering, which I was actually hired to, more into commodity management. And I was actually setting up supply chains around the world. And mostly because I had the expertise from the engineering side on supplier relationships and supplier supply chain. So that's where I kind of honed in some of the, without me knowing it then, the background of how to work with suppliers, how to understand costs from suppliers, how to understand how they go from new product introduction to like full stability. As I kind of grew my career at that contract manufacturer, they said, well, we need somebody who can actually get now the business sense and actually work formally on sourcing, not just understanding the technical aspects of it. So from that, I kind of grew the bones of the fundamentals of sourcing, procurement, commodity management without knowing all the different acronyms. And then what's funny is, I took a little time away to do an MBA to kind of get the credentials of what I've been doing because the higher education, because you may have done it, but you don't know how it's reframed. And I thought the MBA, like a lot of post-secondary education, helps you talk the same language so that all your experience is credible and actually you know how to decode it in a way that other people understand it so that you can actually use it more purposely. I think my greatest learning period was from the MBA and that contract manufacturing. I parlayed it and was asked to join Accenture, which is a consulting company who was doing a lot of source procurement. And that's where I really went through the education of the formality of sourcing and procurement and the different kind of steps you go through and working with probably 10 different clients, how each one is a bit nuanced, but they all use the same underlying process and terminology and how to look at how to become like a true expert in that area so that we can pivot across different steps because nobody wants to go through an elaborate, diligent,
right.
spreadsheet, 7 steps that would take anybody like a long time to go through. You have to be able to navigate. And that's where I think where you start developing, well, I started developing true expertise, where you know enough of every single step of what you could do from end to end, where you're able to navigate based on experience, based on what that company wants or what their appetite is, how to navigate and make it more efficient, right? Because you don't need to kind of go down and do a whole market exercise of every single supplier where that may not be what they want. They may need to look, I have a very finite need. I think I've got like 3 or 4 things I think would be credible. Then you go execute. You don't need to waste a month doing a whole market insight.
Well,
So
here's a question for you, Danny. What do you feel? So you were at Accenture, and so this is like a bit of a consulting firms can be a little bit like a boot camp. You know, you get exposed to, you
yeah.
do these different deployments, you get exposed for a few months to 6 months to a little bit longer at a time to different clients. Do you think that that is a good place for people who are interested in procurement to start their career, or do you think that's a better mid-career move? And do you notice a difference, you know, as you've worked in all these different organizations with the caliber of procurement thought from or work quality of people that have just been in industry consistently as a practitioner
Mhm.
versus folks who have did their tour of duty at a consulting firm with that sort of high intensity?
No, it's a great question because you can take 2 paths. You can go out of school, do consulting, and I think the path that worked out for me is that because I had the experience of what actually is pragmatic in industry and with suppliers, that helped me accelerate my career path within consulting. Because now, instead of just following blindly through a template, I could actually navigate it and have a decent discussion with an equivalent stakeholder who actually knows procurement, who's not a consultant, but industry
Right.
procurement, and talk the same language and saying, here's how I can add value from a consulting sense. I think I've seen people go the other route where they come up the grounds and have like such a much better perspective than I do in terms of all the different consulting templates, all the rigor, all the data analytics, all the things you could do about it. But then they lose sight of the outcome sometimes where they say, okay, but I've done 90 hours of this work where now if I really understood the outcome, what the client wants, I only need to do probably, right? It's like boiling the ocean and analysis paralysis, where I think sometimes consultants go into because they've never lived on the industry side or understood
Right.
how to implement it. And that's one thing I think probably gave me advantage is that I had to implement the solutions I put forth. And then when you implement something, you can see that not everything works out. It's like hard truths and saying, oh, I planned of all these things, but only 50% worked out. And then how do I do it better and better? If I was going to recommend this to somebody else, I would say, well, it's hard because other companies like to hire right out of school. So you don't have any bad habits, right?
Interesting.
If you don't develop bad habits and if you work with a very reputable company that is known for source to procurement, I would always say do a few years there. And if you really want to have diversity of experiences and go to different clients and stuff like that, then join consulting because then you get the real formality and you get both perspectives, the best of both worlds. And like even after Accenture, I joined Walmart, I joined Canada Goose, and like I did stint in hospitality, which I'm still doing hospitality today. And now I'm part of like a great consulting company called Efficio. I can see all that stuff. It's like going back and forth. We see, okay, what did I lose out? What did I gain? Unbiased. I think I did it the right way because even going back into consulting, I see now the higher sophistication of processes and templates, but the fundamental experience that I've garnered outside of consulting is irreplaceable. It's invaluable because now you know how to look at the outcome and say, okay, this template, this process is good, but this is what we really need. So let's not go through every single aspect. Let's like focus on what's important still. And then with, of course, AI, it's accelerated for everything, right? You can now fast track in half with the use of AI.
Have you ever had a situation, Danny, when you were at Canada Goose or Walmart, where you interacted with, when you were in the seat, in the practitioner seat, where you interacted with consultants that had been brought in and you just totally disagreed with what their perspective was because of that difference between like the boots on the ground versus the abstract theory?
I wouldn't say disagree. I would say I would understand their intentions. And even today, when I work with the Efficio folks and, a lot of great SMEs, a lot of great, consulting power that they have, I can appreciate the intention of what they want to do and how they want to do things. And I can balance that with giving, say, feedback to them. Just like what I did at Walmart or Canada Goose when I was working with a lot of consultants saying, I get you got to follow this process, but take my perspective into account where this stuff here you're going to spend a lot of time analyzing, not as meaningful to what I think the outcome will be. Try it your way. And then when you realize that the outcome is much simpler than what you had done beforehand, then let's work together. So I think it's appreciating, like I would never, because like I would say the majority of consultants, they can drive a lot of value if they're given explicit direction or given an understanding of why sometimes you just can't follow 100 different steps in a way. So when you think about that and think about sort of what the client or myself are trying to get at to, I had to take more time to explain to them what I really want. Then they can internalize it and say, oh, you know what? Yeah, I don't need to waste my time scouring 100 different suppliers because you've kind of given me enough direction that I can only have to find like maybe 20,
Yeah, it's
right?
true.
Because like
So
I can narrow down the scope a lot for you. It's not just wide open.
So maybe a bit more concretely, if you had to say like there's some things that consultants overestimate the value on and some things that they are underestimating the value on. What are one or two examples of things that you think, consultants generally overestimate the value of, and then you're like, hey, these are the nuts and bolts things that I actually care about. What are the one or two things that they underestimate the value of? And it sounded like maybe supplier discovery might be one of those things that they're overestimating, or maybe
Yeah.
it's like PowerPoint deliverables. I'd love to just get a sense of like, just some insight for the audience.
PowerPoint deliverables are definitely a key aspect. I've worked for so many different consulting firms, and even my work today with Efficio. For those folks who have been in industry, they rely on the professionalism of PowerPoint because that's their only deliverable. Someone at the partner level at Accenture told me this. Imagine that if you're not implementing anything, you're not visiting factories, stuff like that. When you leave, you're leaving behind this PowerPoint, and that's all they're going to remember you by, right?
Yeah.
And that's why they think about it. I'm going to make it so perfect, and I make sure that it's so jam packed information, it's convoluted. That's why it's a different approach. Where if you think of, I love the use of PowerPoints, but I use PowerPoints to streamline my communications.
Right.
I don't use it to throw everything at the soup, the soup nuts and bolts in the kitchen into saying this is my deliverable at the end of the day I'm gonna leave behind. It's a different perspective. So I think that's one thing where consultants spend a long time, curating it. When I say, okay, all I care about is a tagline and a few key metrics. I don't care about. It shouldn't take me more than 2 minutes to digest a slide
Yeah.
because I'm so much information there. It's like I gotta choose my adventure by following this thought, this thought, this thought, this thought.
Mm,
And like maybe it's just me, but as from when I was a client or industry perspective, I wanted to keep things so simple that I could sell it to anybody else. If you make it
right.
too hard for me to understand, okay, then I'm not going to be able to effectively sell that to somebody else. So that's where I think slide work needs to be curated and bespoke upon the needs of whoever you're using it for. Because you could have a different way. You could have needs for communication versus needs as a appendix that you will keep
Right.
reference back, right? That's one thing. And then I think what's the other point you had? You had about another example of, oh,
Yeah, things that basically are you think are
yeah,
underappreciated by consultants that you're like, "Hey, look, if I could bring you in at a quarter of the cost and all you did was 1 and 2,
yeah,
that would be a home run for me."
yeah. Well, I don't know about part of the cost, but maybe let's use this example from Ken and Goose. So when we are finding, exploring new supply bases, right? There's three things that I really kind of thought about, and it was kind of Goose specific. It may not work for all apparel brands, but for them, it's saying if you're going to find a new supplier, there's three tenements, all right, that I think about. Number one is else do they work with? If they're working with other credible brands that we think are comparable to us or close to comparable to us, that's already a nice filter.
Yeah.
We're not working with a bunch of these other folks, then let's not waste our time. And that's one
Yeah.
thing where a paper, like what they could say in a spreadsheet and RFI on paper, may not actually be true because anybody can say anything on paper. And without it visiting the factory, you don't know. So one of the things I put in place is let's understand what other brands are working with, right? Let's understand also what type of product portfolio they're working with those other brands without breaking confidentiality, right? Because if
Right.
there's a good match on those two aspects, then high reasonable that they're going to be a match for you. And number three, of course, like obviously, their quality, their competence, all the kind of things that you would normally get. But I focus on that first as the strongest filter. And that's where, think about where maybe some consultants would say, okay, I'm going to RFI all these suppliers and do this comprehensive RFI with 100 different questions and really focus on equipment list, focus on, materials, focus on all these things. But then they say, oh, the last thing is like customer referrals.
Typically, what's the best source of information to understand who else a supplier is working with? Is it just to ask them directly? And how often do you think it's accurate? Do they kind of goose the numbers up? Do you then go check with those customers? Like, and real practical, like what's the best way to figure out? And I love this idea, by the way. If they are supplying a, a high caliber customer, they'll probably be a high caliber supplier.
Best and foremost thing that sometimes consultants are hard to do with, but industry can, is you have to visit these factories,
Okay.
right? That's when you can tell what's really happening because you can see the products. Because to your point, a supplier could have worked with all these brands 5 years ago. They're
Right.
not lying. So you have to like say, okay, tell me within the last 2 years, who have you worked with and what have you worked with them on? Well, within the realm of, not breaking confidentiality. That gives you a paper audit to say, here's a paper filter. And then you got to go visit the factories because in the apparel, it's a role where it's based on really on experience and name dropping, right? Because there's only so many great suppliers that are well known. So you have to kind of build that reputation. So it's a lot based on reputation that okay, you can talk the same parameter of good suppliers, then that builds some credibility. But that's why I think one thing with consultants, sometimes if they don't have very experienced needs like myself, you've never visited the factories. So you're taking somebody's word for it. Like how much can you validate?
Why can't consultants do that work? Why can't they visit the factory and see for themselves if they're running a project like, hey, we're going to build a new supply base for a given category? Is there some reason why they can't go and fly to? I remember at Tesla, we'd go to Juarez for
It has to be investment because you can't charge the client for it.
the projects from consultants do feel, they're not they're high value, high cost engagements very often. And
Mm.
so the cost of the flights and the hotel and spending a day on site, it doesn't seem that big to me, but maybe it's just not what.
Larger consulting firms are charging a lot, but I see the trend right now where people are moving away from that because they're saying, well, how do you justify these fees, right? So you have to go more practically. So for true sourcing and procurement consulting firms, the ones that actually do it and are pragmatic and are execution based, those folks are very efficient and economical. They're not going to have a lot of buffer to fly people. And that's why on the right market, I think if you can justify it, it's basically okay. We can fly somebody to accompany, the stakeholder to kind of visit these factories and kind of reconfirm what we know. But imagine, like, you're not going to have a dedicated SME like myself 100% to one project or another project, right? It's going to be costly for me to go visit the world with a client. So it's trade-offs, but that's where you have to find the right consulting firms who actually have that experience base. And to my earlier point, if they're industry hires, they come with that.
Yes, of course. Are there any like third party service providers that you've seen where that's like their only bread and butter, where they just maybe have, I mean, I'm imagining a business that I don't even know if it exists, where they have, one person who's like a supply industrialization engineer, like an SIE or a category manager in each region, and all they do is do like, supplier visits by the.
No, and that's where you have some of these Asian brokers where because they work with so many different clients, they built up this experience of visiting every single factory in a certain region. But
Yeah.
like a broker, they're charging overhead on top of that, right? And with a broker, what they're suggesting for you could be the same as suggesting for somebody else. So it may not be as bespoke, but in the historical days, even with like contract manufacturing electronics and even in the apparel, you have still these entities that are massive brokers that connect you with the right suppliers because they've used them, because they visited them. So, but you have to pay for that.
Course. And I guess what about the certification groups? Like, for example, if someone has an ISO 9000 certification, it's a piece of paper that says like, okay, someone from ISO has visited our factory. They've verified that we have, quality process, that process is being adhered to, that the equipment that we say we have, how much do you rely on those certifications? Is that a must do when you're evaluating new suppliers?
That's a deep question because I used to use that as part of my audits for a lot of suppliers. So let me give you an analogy. Okay, it's like an engineering degree.
Yep.
So you have 100 engineers, they all have an engineering degree. How would you say that one engineer is better than another? Because it's so dependent upon the scope, so dependent upon that discipline. So for ISO, the thing about ISO, there's no standard in terms of the breadth of that company. So if that
Mm.
company does one little process and they document it, you're ISO certified, right? It doesn't speak to saying, oh, can they do 10 different types of products? Do they do design? So is the whole thing about ISO, as long as they document what they do, they're ISO because they've documented it, but it doesn't talk to the breadth and the competence that they have.
Interesting. Are there other certifications beyond ISO that you think do speak to this a little bit more directly, or is there no? Because I imagine the certification could be like a proxy for the on-site visit. Like if I could pay somebody to go and do the certification, then they might be doing that role of the on-site visit, of the inspection, of making sure that the company is what they say they are, that they have the right DBA, doing business as name, and that matches up with their legal entity, and that their bank account is verified. Like, is there something beyond ISO that like maybe SAE standards or something? I'm thinking out loud, like where somebody could say, hey, I can just check the box.
Well, what usually happens, like or any manufacturing field, if they've gone through a manufacturing audit by a reputable brand, I will lean on that too, because I would try and but it has to be a bespoke audit, right? Like let's say Even at Goose or even at my previous contracts, manufacturer, we had our own special audit because we had our own products. So we had to
Yeah.
make sure that we had to kind of audit to our standard of quality, our standard of customer service, and all this kind of thing. So there isn't a generic one out there, and no company right now would actually rely on a generic standard. It could help augment it. You'd always have to be customized in one way. So that's why different ISO certifications are great to have because it says, okay, I don't have to go through that deep that they've got a paper trail. If they've done ISO, here's aspects. They've got a bare minimum that they have some sort of compliance to documenting things. But now I got to make sure that what I want to audit against, is it going to be the quality level? Is it going to be like the competence level? Is it going to be the expertise level? How do I audit that?
Interesting. And how much would you rely on if you're at Goose? I don't know what would be a good alternative, but if a supplier, for example, is supplying to Arc'teryx, I imagine that's a company that's in the same. Is it enough to be like, hey, they're supplying they're supplying a meaningful SKU that is similar to ours, but at Arc'teryx? Do you ever share information between companies? Does that ever happen, or is that?
It's
Yeah.
usually when you approach a supplier, they're allowed to disclose who else they work for. Simply put, if it's a raw material supplier who supplies
Yep.
fabric, this fabric is fabric. It's not as complicated as a finished garment. So we
Right.
have a supplier of fabric, and they say, "Look, I supply fabric, not telling you exactly what fabric, but I supply fabric to these 10 comparable brands." I would look at it saying, yeah, I recognize all of them. They're very comparable. I know their quality standards are pretty good. I'm comfortable that you go to the next stage of an on-site audit because then we can go deeper into in terms of their culture fit, in terms of the dedicated account team they would have for me, in terms of the competence of, let's say, seam sealing, perhaps, or some
Right.
nuance wonderful thing that I would need for my products. Then I can go down. So it's basically that reference point. It's like getting an MBA from Harvard. Just because he has an MBA from Harvard, you're going to hire him out straight. You have to say, okay, my first filter is anybody who has a degree from good school. I'm going to entertain their resume. If they don't have a good degree from a good school, I'm not even going to entertain it.
Right, right. But then you still have to do the check
Yeah.
yourself. I mean, ultimately, that's the way it works. And I mean, I guess there's also, just thinking about it, there's ways to dip the toes in without going whole hog, right? You could start with a small program or maybe a 10% of volume, and that could be the test. Like, because if they don't deliver, it's not catastrophic, and then ramp up eventually to, hey, this is a core preferred supplier. What about the tiers? This is always, I think, one of those topics that gets a lot of conversation, but I'm not sure if folks really end up doing a lot of action against it. But how do you think about trying to understand the tier two, tier three supply base? Is that something that when you're awarding a supplier, you're already asking about? Does the supplier feel at liberty to give you that kind of information? How important is it? I'd love to sort of get your two
No,
cents.
it's very important, especially with what happened with supply chain transparency and traceability in the last couple of years with all the ESG initiatives and all the labor concerns that people had. This is
Yep.
what started it. And similar to what food went through many, many years ago. You
Right.
have to know every single part of who does what and who supplies what product for you to be assured that the last quality aspect fulfills all the regulations for ethical, sourcing, ethical behavior, that kind of stuff. So if you're looking at new providers, they have to provide you that transparency. If they're not, then I would not touch them with a 10-foot pole.
So here's a question, because I know that in certain industries, traceability has gotten a lot more, I would say, focus. So food makes sense. Certainly, the apparel industry is a huge one. I
Mhm.
mean, we've talked about traceability many times. People wanting to make sure that there's no forced labor in certain regions, that you're not getting materials from a country that's in a sort of a sanction list. But in my experience, when I was in automotive, you'd ask a supplier, "Hey, can you disclose your tier one, our tier two?" And they'd say, like, "No way, because that's our proprietary info." And they don't want you to go to the tier two at some point eventually yourself and try to quote them out, right? Get their prices to try to negotiate away their margin. So in a way, I feel that something about the fact that traceability has come from a regulatory perspective with garment, you can look at the supplier and say, "Hey, look, it's not that I'm trying to get
Mhm.
secret intel. It is literally just a requirement for me and for
Mhm.
anyone that you work with, that we
Mhm.
collect this level of traceability, batch level traceability information, in fact." So I'm kind of curious, like, how has that conversation gone? in garment versus in other industries? How much has the regulation been actually a benefit for the OEMs to be able to ask that question without appearing to want to?
I think that's completely changed. And I think the other big factor thing is tariffs. How to overcome tariffs? You're gonna have to know exactly the raw materials and where they're coming from, right? And who provides that value add of putting things together, manufacturing, because it's gonna be complicated in tariff calculations.
Right. Well, does that give you, well, here's the question. What's the level of info that you need then? Because if I was a tier one and someone said, "Hey, I need to know your tier twos for tariff purposes," I might say, "Sure, I'll tell you where they're located. I'll tell you what they supply us. I'll tell you the dollar value, but I won't tell you who they are." And I don't want you talking directly to them because that's my proprietary info. And I don't want you sharing my supply base with my competitors, for example. So what's the level of information that you really feel it's fair to ask suppliers,
I think
you
it's
know?
dependent upon the company because that goes into trade compliance. They're right, not only from ESG, but from a trade compliance aspect, as things got more complicated for tariffs and costing, and also for exceptions because of special country to country percentages of what you can ship, duty free versus non duty free. How do you verify that information? So the thing we'd always go back, look, it's fine that you have a generic blase that things are manufactured here, but how are you going to validate this? Because if you can't validate it, guess what? It's stuck in customs and we'll never get it. Who's going to be liable for that? So that's why trade compliance is important, that you need enough details of that supply chain, and they have to find some way to provide that transparency. The easiest thing is that agreement where I'm not going to go and undercut you because I don't have the sophistication to go and buy directly from that sub tier because I'm not going to be putting together. Guess what?
Yeah,
You're the sub assembly. You're going to put it all together. I'm not going to create my infrastructure to put it together. So there has to
yeah.
be a level of understanding and partnership of saying, I need this so we don't get in trouble with trade compliance. I can get as much benefits or leeway from tariffs for ESG, for tariffs, everything else. So I think it's a conversation. And quite frankly, if a supplier is very hesitant, and automobile may be different because it's so tight margins there, but for other industries, it's hard to replace if that person is doing such a viable sub-assembly role, right? And if they're not gouging you, and that's why if they're refusing to give that information, what else is happening? And that would raise alarm bells. Gouging is one thing, but I'm not as worried about that as I am about, are they really getting it from that supplier?
Right.
Right?
Yeah, well, how do you, I guess here's the question. Let's say they do tell you, and if we're in the world of are they really question mark, do we need to audit that as well, right? Like, is that something, and where does the practical reality end, right? Because in theory,
Yeah.
maybe I should be like, hey, where are you getting from your suppliers different materials? And now that you've told me, I also need shipment records. I want to see the
Yeah.
batch level information. And then eventually it just becomes like, hey, like, we're doing 10 times the amount of work that we were before because we're trying to audit all this stuff. So where does the threshold kind of end? And I'm also kind of curious, could this be, if the issue is really customs, could you just say, hey, look, either we do X works and you give me that information, or we do DDP and I don't need as much because then you're responsible for.
But I think it's industry specific. I know food and apparel, they actually have tools in place now because they have different certification standards that automate that through AI. You basically work with third party certification houses that for you to actually get the certification that something is organic or recyclable or something, you have to do it anyways. And the automation is it scans that certificate and verifies that it's legitimate. So it's all automated. So there's not a lot of burden because they're already using third party certifications.
Interesting. So here's a question. Does the third party element make it easier for this kind of data sharing? Like, I'll give an example. We had a customer that wanted to see our financial statements, and we don't we're a private company. We don't share our financials with anyone, but we wanted to get this deal done. And so what ended up happening was we didn't actually share it directly with them. They worked with a third party called Rapid Ratings, which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
just one of many sort of
Yeah, what
companies
a
that
minute.
does kind of, yeah. And so I felt as a founder, right? I'm like, okay, I'm not sharing our financials directly with the customer. I'm sharing with a third party who doesn't
Yep.
really have an interest in this. And all what I did was I sent them the full financials, and then they sent just the digest. What's
Yeah, yeah,
where are
yeah.
they A on the balance sheet, they're A plus on this.
That's
Yeah.
why third parties always going to pay for third parties because they're going to be the mediators. They're going to be the ones that holds the sense of information and give the output that's required by that other party. And a lot of times, whether it's consulting or industry, sourcing procurement groups always ask for more than they should because there's no harm in asking.
Sure, of course. As a vendor, because you don't know what's the nice to have, what's the have to have, right?
Yeah.
And
And that's where you have to go. And for the more sophisticated, suppliers, you have to really understand what are you trying to get out of this. And if you
right.
discover more financial viability and health, and we have a healthy balance sheet, okay, I can give you some of that stuff, or well, how about third party validate us because you would trust a third party rating system without disclosing the numbers.
It's funny, I'll tell you a story, like, when we were doing this thing, we're a growth stage company, right? And so the way that our business works is that we raise outside private equity VC funding, we invest in growth, and then when we get close to needing cash again, we go back to the market and raise. And ideally, we've made a lot of progress. And so it's funny because in this case, I mean, it was just a little personal story, but I remember we were like, like we're about to do this huge fundraise with Lightspeed and Bain, as you may remember from earlier this year. We raised one of the biggest sort of Series A financings of all time, 33 million at a 130 million valuation. By the way, you were like one of the first people that Idon and I ever met when we started this journey. So like you remember what it was like,
Yeah.
Megan making the intro to be
Yeah.
like, hey, like these are two kids in a garage, so just be aware of that. But it was funny because when we're doing the rapid ratings, we're like, okay, if we do this in a week, we'll have a totally different balance sheet than we did. It was
Yeah.
good timing because we were able to be like, okay, here's our financials. And then it was inter quarter. So we did like an adjusted financials and we were like, okay, here's our financials now. And all of a sudden the metric looked like their balance sheet cash coverage was like insane because all of a sudden we had this like
Yeah.
lump sum more cash than most large companies even do. And so that
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
really funny change in our financial metrics, but the business itself didn't change. It was just that we had a big cash infusion. But no, I mean it's really interesting. I'm kind of curious. So like going back to the topic of like asking questions to suppliers, I feel like there's always this implication of the power dynamic, right? Like if you are a more powerful buyer, you can ask more questions, more of your supplier than you can otherwise. So then again, like I remember even at Tesla, like early on when we were just getting started, and we were doing the Model S and X, we're doing 1,000 cars per week. So we're a small player. We're a rounding error for the automotive industry. We would have to almost sell the opportunity to
Yeah.
suppliers to be willing to work with us.
Yeah.
And then by the Model 3, it's like, okay, we're making 10 million vehicles, much more substantial program. I can imagine the same might be true for when you were at Walmart. I'm kind of curious, like, because there it's like Walmart famously has, well, one, it's a very sophisticated supply chain org. It's the New York Yankees of supply
Right.
chain org in many ways, but there's a lot of buyer power. And so there's a lot that you can ask of the suppliers. Then when you go to Canada Goose, amazing like high equity
Yeah.
brand equity, like very, but it's luxury. And so you're not doing the same kind of volume that you are at Walmart. So I'm kind of curious, did you notice a difference in like suppliers' willingness to give you that extra cut of information to bend over backwards? Because I remember when I was at Tesla, there were certain tier ones, that where they would just say, we'd send them our quote breakdown sheet and they'd say, that's very nice. Here's our price list. And there was like no way to get it in that additional level of detail.
Yeah.
90% of our suppliers would, but there were always a few that were just, they were bigger than Tesla. So they actually had the leverage here. So I'm kind of curious how you find that buyer size versus supplier power dynamic coming into play, especially going from a place like Walmart to Canada Goose.
So a lot of providers and potential suppliers would love to have like the brands of Four Seasons, Canada Goose, and Walmart itself is a huge brand because if you can do Walmart, you can do anybody. So I think it's a balance to it. But it's always one of those things where the way I like to work sort of in procurement is developing a relationship. It can't be tactical because tactical will only get you a year or two. If you're going to have longevity with your company and a supplier partner, you got to go through the roadmap on long term. Say what's the benefit for all of us. And look, if we don't know each other yet, here's how we can kind of get to know each other. But then, like a couple of years down the road, now that we know each other and we've got the strong partnership, we need that transparency because we're trying to help each other find optimization. Because if I don't have that detailed breakdown of whatever I don't know. To my earlier point, I can't tell you what's meaningful to me because I don't have enough information to go on, and you
Mhm.
can't. Well, that's meaningful to me because you don't know what I'm thinking about until we go through some of the data. But funny story about Walmart, when I was there, they were I was Canada only, so not Bentonville. Bentonville operates a little bit different than Canada, but Canada, I found a similar analogy I run across my time working with a lot of big Asian suppliers or big Asian companies, where when you will have the scale and you're focused on speed and revenue turnover, you've become very logical and pragmatic. You start moving away from pride to saying who's got a bigger hammer, right? I find with smaller companies, because they sometimes become too proudful, they say, I got the bigger hammer. You need to do this because I'm very meaningful. Well, Walmart, even the Canadian side, right? They're the biggest retailer in Canada. They are very pragmatic. Their legal team are very pragmatic. And they basically, at the end, they had to, when they did pull the hammer, they said, okay, I get these are some, constraints and some terms and like that, but you're telling me that the market is doing this and this and this. I'm telling you, I am the market. This is something that's very pragmatic, logical. We do not need to see who's got a bigger appendage, right? Let's just get to it. It's done. So I think that's why I appreciate when the companies are becoming at a point larger and they realize that time is money, they become very pragmatic and realistic. And they say, I can accept this and this because it's not meaningful. I don't need to bicker upon this term, that term, because in the end, it doesn't mean anything. That's why I love the whole aspect of outcome-based thinking.
Interesting. Well, also, I'm kind of curious, like as a holding company, I was sort of shocked when we last spoke and you were at Aqor. I had never heard of that company before, which is very classic. I know there's a lot of companies like this where it's like the biggest company you've never heard of. Like another one is, I was talking with my parents about some industrial businesses or tier one autos, and they never have heard of them. But it's like, oh, this is a huge business. And of course they knew, of course, about the Fairmont and the Sofitel and Raffle. It's sort of funny because you think that these are maybe sort of boutiques, but then you realize, oh, they're part of a huge group. I guess a question I'm sort of curious about is how much are they operated independently, versus a centralized procurement organization, and what's the benefit of that?
And that's one thing I think some people don't realize in hospitality. So the best analogy I say in most of the hospitality brands or holding companies, they're assetless, right? Or they don't own the property. Somebody else owns the property. And this property owner, it's whether, a big PE firm or very wealthy individuals. I'm talking about the luxury hotels. For everything else, it could be more, commoditized, but you have the management company, they're there and they're contracted to manage the brand and manage their property and hire everybody. So they do it all end to end, whereas they don't own the property. So every property could have a different owner. And what makes these luxury properties unique is that every owner may have a little bit of nuance of what they want. And that's one of the things where you look at classic consulting, where classic company that is more centrally managed, a deal that you may do, you sign a contract, it's implemented. Easy. There's hardly any implementation required for most projects, right? In hospitality. So the ratio I give is in hospitality, 40% is your strategic sourcing, where you work with somebody, you come up with, options, you come up with a fantastic proposal that's going to drive a lot of value back to the properties. Hospitality, 60% is deployment or convincing every single property to agree to go on that corporate deal. Depending on the portfolio, some companies are more attuned to adopt it because they kind of trust, what's being happening. And some others say, well, I don't know. I got to talk to the owner. I got to talk to the GM. So it's a lot of work goes into, and this helps. It actually helps the procurement team become better because they always are thinking about what is the owner going to think about? What is that property going to think about? How do I make sure that the deal I do is flexible enough that it can be a little more tailored?
But I'm surprised that the property owner still has a say, right? Because I feel like if I were, for example, a hotel operator, even if asset light, I would say, hey, look, I've got a brand to maintain, I've got a quality of service to maintain, I'm responsible for filling the rooms. So like when I lease the building or I lease the land, like you have to be, comfortable with the idea that I'm gonna bring in the vendors I want, I'm gonna run it the way I want. So I mean, how much does and you don't want to corral like, hundreds of individual landlords to approve things that are operational. So, I mean, doesn't that become an issue, or can't they just write it into the contracts early on? Like,
Some things that can be mandated, like anything branded is usually mandated, regardless of any hospitality company. Usually it's saying, if you're gonna carry the flag of a Marriott, you're gonna make sure that these branded Marriott items you're gonna have no ifs and buts. You can't go off and do your own thing, right?
Of course.
Whereas that's only a portion of the picture. There's so many things that are not branded, which people that own more luxury portfolios, they're very passionate and dynamic individuals. They're going to have a say because it's going to be their signature as well. They're very in tune. So sometimes there are a lot of more passionate aspects of a hotel, running a hotel, that you have to navigate. Like, I'll give you an example: Michelin star restaurant. You're gonna
Yeah.
tell Michelin star chef, "I'm sorry, you're gonna have to go with the generic commodity of this beef that's frozen all the time." They're gonna say, "I'm sorry, the reason why I'm a Michelin star chef is I'm getting a very local Wagyu from Snake River or something from Kobe. I'm gonna determine what's gonna make my restaurant work. I'm not gonna listen to corporate, nor would I ever tell them to buy this beef." But I'm giving you an example where you do need to have a little bit of a tailored solution depending on that property's outlets, features, and the personality. You don't want to have something that you can just drop from one sunny area to another sunny area. You want something a bit special about that property.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, Danny, I know we're just about at time. I've got one last question for you, and this is a little bit of a fun brain teaser. But is there any company with a procurement organization that you just respect so much, you've never had a chance to work with, but you know that they're great and you'd love to work with them?
I think the only one that comes to mind is Costco. I've heard of what they do, and I've heard stories of how well they manage programs. And I go to Costco myself, and I shop there. And I'm saying, man, some of the stuff is really good and so affordable. I understand bulk pricing, but how do they get access to like the fresh fruits and vegetables? How do they get access to this stuff? So that's one area where maybe it's just a fable thing where that's one area that I've never been able to really talk to anybody who actually is within the street sourcing group at Costco. Say, how do they do things? And if I think of liquor, they're the number one buyer of liquor around the world. Costco.
Wow, it's amazing. Well, Danny, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I had a ton of fun. I always love our conversations, even more now that we get to share it with some other folks.
Yeah, definitely.